So I'd like to introduce Fabian Flöck, previously of the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and now of GESIS, the Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences, University of Cologne. Fabian?
Thank you. So let me set up. So first of all, thank you very much, Richard, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here in this great room, in this great place, and with these great co-speakers. So I'm trying to set this up here, sorry. Good. So, I was already introduced. I'm from the Computational Social Science Department, a newly found department in GESIS, which is a Leibniz Institute for Social Sciences, like an infrastructure institute for German universities interested in sociology and working in sociology. And my talk is going to be about mining cross-cultural relations from Wikipedia. And this is mainly about a paper we had at the ACM Web Science Conference this year. And the subtitle of that paper is A Study of 31 European Food Cultures. In this paper I'm mainly going to talk about, and I'll also give you some insights about things we did after we finished that paper to elaborate a little more on the content. This is work I've done together with my colleagues Paul, Claudia, and Marcus at GESIS. So culture, of course, is known to everyone as a term, but is not commonly defined in the same way everywhere. It's really hard to grasp. So one thing you can do is look at internal beliefs or values, which is people try to do, for example, in surveys. But it's hard to do. Maybe easier to do is to observe cultural practices, because, as has been argued quite often, is that cultural practices are actually correlated with culture and maybe with intrinsic beliefs, and you can actually observe them much more easily. So what we did here is we looked at culinary practices as one part of these cultural practices. And culinary practices have also been argued to be tightly connected to culture, and as has language, which will also play a role later on. And that's why we chose to look at culinary practices, how they are described in Wikipedia, of different countries. And the countries we chose for that were mainly countries that are in the EU, for reasons of comparing with other data sets mainly, but also to have a more tightly knit data set where we actually have descriptions of each other in every language, including also Russia and Turkey, and also Catalonia as an independent country, at least for us. And what you see here is actually the most distinctive. So we did a term frequency, inverse document frequency thing on the most mentioned concepts for these countries and the ingredients or dishes that they have, and that's what you see here, like the two most distinctive things that you can find on Wikipedia pages in the other languages. But yeah, what we did then is we went to the language editions of Wikipedia that exist and mapped them to those countries, which in most cases is a one-to-one mapping. In some cases like Austria and Germany and Ireland and England, for example, it would be three countries to one language, but that is the minority. What we did then is we got the Wikipedia pages for those countries about their cuisines. So for example, you see here the Finnish cuisine described in the Finnish Wikipedia. And the pictures already tell you that they talk about some kind of cheese cake thing and berries. And here's the German one. Of course, there's sausage and potatoes. That's not a surprise. And we have the English one, which actually talks about pastries mostly when it talks about the Finnish cuisine. And we have the Spanish one. What we did, we were not looking at pictures because that's a little bit more complicated, but the linked dishes or ingredients in Wikipedia, in terms of Wikipedia pages that are linked. So here you have, for example, fish linked in the English description and pescado in the English one, in the Spanish one, and via the interlanguage links you can actually find out that's the same concept. So obviously, when we look at all the concepts, we can find out if they talk about the same concepts. We did three different metrics. One is similarity, which is looking at how equally described are Russia and Ukraine, for example, in the other languages, or on all languages, in terms of the concept that I mentioned. Then understanding, how well does Russia understand Ukraine and vice versa. And affinity, in terms of mostly views how much attention does Russia give to Ukraine and vice versa. So the two bottom ones are actually asymmetric, while the first one is symmetric. So similarity was done in a way that I describe here on an example. You take all the different languages that we have, the 27, and how they describe it, which concepts they describe, the Italian one, the Italian cuisine, and the German cuisine. And what you do a Jacquard similarity. So I'm going to talk about the Jacquard similarity. We also did other metrics, but this one there was not much difference. So, and what you do is like take the intersection of those two sets and divide it by the union of those two sets. So you get an idea of how similar they are. How similarly they are described by all the languages. And we also did it for the local self-description of Italian and German here, for example, but it didn't matter much in terms of what we found out. So what you get is then a ranked list of pairs, which are most similar to least similar. And for example, we have the most similar ones are Russian and Ukrainian cuisine, and the Belgian and the Bulgarian are least similar, according to this global definition and description. Then for us, of course, this made intuitively sense, but we want to validate it more, like doing a plausibility check at least to see if that actually makes sense. So we gave it to crowd workers, so people that do little jobs on the internet for a little bit of money, and we asked them, gave them some of one of the top pairs and one of the bottom pairs, and asked them which one of those two pairs the cuisines are more similar. Turns out that in all but one of those cases that we gave them, they actually did the same. They agreed to our ranking of those cuisines. So that is a first indicator that might maybe actually make sense how we ranked it here. The second thing we did was actually looking at the neighbor states. So you can get the neighbor states, for example, for Belgium, you would get France and Germany, et cetera, and Holland. And then you would actually see that the similarity of the cuisines for those neighbor states is notably higher than for the non-neighbor states. So that again is kind of circumstantial evidence, like 1.5 was the average increase in the Jacquard similarity. So that is a substantial increase, and it actually gives you some evidence again that this might maybe something that you're measuring that makes sense in terms of that it actually describes culture. And another thing we did is there's the European Social Survey. This one measures values and beliefs, like by questioning people from these countries about their views of loyalty, traditions, and authority, and ranking. Then we took a scientific work that actually produced a ranked list on those on these. He scored these countries on a scale from 0 to 1, and actually did a ranking with these ranked pairs just as we did, and we did a correlation with this. Turns out that correlation is not very high, but that is not surprising because what we're actually measuring are the cultural practices, while what this ranking was measuring are the beliefs. But somehow, at least there is some correlation. We still have to find out what it stems from. Cultural understanding was the second thing we did. So you take one cuisine, the Italian one, look at its self-description, the concept that it mentions, and then you look at other languages and see how they describe the Italian cuisine. And that would give you an understanding, that would give you a picture of how well, for example, the Swedish one matches the description of the Italian one, understanding the native definition. Here the German one does not, and the Swedish one does to a certain extent. Here is a bit loaded heat map of the whole picture, what you get out of this cultural understanding. So on the top you would have the language editions, and on the left side you would have all the cuisines. You already see that it's kind of sparse, so if you have a little cross there, that means there is no description in that language. However, you can see some of the patterns here. For example, you see that the French, so that would be at a Catalonian language edition, that would be the row number 3 here, where we have the first pair of arrows pointing. They understand the Iberian cuisines quite well. That is not surprising, I guess. Then we would also see that France actually understands many cuisines very well, but also Scandinavia particularly well, for especially Swedish and Finnish. That might maybe be surprising. What you also see is that French and Italian, as very popular cuisines, have very uniformly and over all language editions, or most of them, a quite good understanding, at least they're covered. But so does Swedish and Turkish. So why would some states on the outskirts of Europe be so well understood in their cuisine? And we looked for patterns in this. So we couldn't explain it, and we tried to explain it. So of course the first thing is to look at the similarity. If I'm similar to someone, I might understand him better, right? Turns out that's not the case. Turns out that the similarity is very weakly correlated actually with understanding. Secondly, we looked also at the European Social Survey again, which also is a ranking of similarity, and not surprisingly, it's also quite low. A third thing we looked at is migration rates. So when you look at Germany and you look at, see the fact that Turkey and Poland have the most migrants to Germany, we assumed that Turkish people now speaking German, cooking Turkish dishes, and writing in the German Wikipedia would also lead to the German Wikipedia understanding Turkish dishes better. So that would explain that the Turkish Wikipedia, which has a lot of migrants in many countries, would actually, the Turkish cuisine would actually be well understood in many languages. Well, there is a correlation, but it's not really high. However, if you think about how many factors go into understanding a cuisine, that is actually, in that context, it's actually quite a high correlation, and it at least points to the fact that migration is some factor in here, probably. By far not the only one, but there is a factor here, we guess. The last thing we did is cultural affinity, and we've defined this with two things. So the outlinks, I mean the linked concepts, are the things that I talked about, just like the Wikipedia links. And the more Wikipedia links to give to some cuisine, the more interest or more affinity you have to that cuisine. That's what we thought, what we defined. So that also correlates highly with the length of the article usually. Yeah? So you can also think about just the length of how much you write about it. So that would mean I write more about the Italian in a German Wikipedia, I'm more interested in it. The other thing is that we took is views. So you can get the view data sets of a specific language edition, and actually you can see what the readers do, how much they actually look at the different cuisine pages in that language. That is important because when you think about how many people actually write an article, there could be 5 to 10 people sometimes. So we're not sure if they represent the language at some point or somehow. So the view was important for us, first of all because it's a different community than the editors, and second of all because it's much more. So many more people that actually do that. So what we did is we took the attention in these two dimensions here, and yeah, build a metric like this. Don't be scared, it's actually easier than it looks like. So the first thing you did, and let's maybe look at the first term only before the minus, it actually is just a percentage that when I'm in the German Wikipedia and I'm looking, I want to know how much of my total attention I give to cuisines goes to the Italian one. Then I just take the attention to the Italian one and divide it by the attention I give to everyone else, to all the other cuisines. And then I have a percentage of attention that I give to cuisines and how much of that goes to Italian. So I normalized by that first of all. What we did in the second term is we did that for all the countries that we had in the data set, for all the languages we had in the data set, and for Italian as well, to find out what is the normal, like the global interest in Italian. Yeah? So if the global interest in Italian is always 50% of all views, then it's not a surprise that in German it's also 50% of all views. So in that case, if it's 50% in every language and in German, it would be, this metric would give us 0, because it is exactly what we expect. So in this metric can go from -1, so much less than we would expect, to +1. Like the most, we could expect much more than we would see in all the other languages and compared to all the other cuisines. Okay? So here you would get a list like this, for example. For the view affinity in German would be a little higher than we would expect in Italian, in Turkish, and in Russian, for example. Yeah? So people watch more than we would expect, look more at the Italian one. Then to make sense out of this, we looked at two things, which one is self-focus, how much more than you would expect do they look at their own cuisine, and regional focus, how much more than you would expect do they look at their neighbors. And what we found out is that in self-focus, and as well in the outlinks as in the views, there is a significant, not significant, but notable, it's also statistically significant, but it's notable self-focus, which should not surprise anyone, especially when you read works by Brent, for example, that people find out the same things that countries do have a self-focus on their own pages. But what you don't see here is a strong regional focus. So obviously the viewers and the editors are not much more interested in their neighbors. We also correlated that to the affinity, the understanding and the similarity scores. Interestingly, understanding and affinity are negatively correlated, and similarity and affinity only moderately to low. I have no explanation for this so far. We're still working on finding out why that is and what are the exact things that lead to this. But at least we know that there is no, well, you would expect that understanding and affinity are actually highly correlated, at least for common sense, but obviously that's not the case. We also did something to do another check to look at the Eurovision Song Contest. You might recognize that winner, which was looking at the votes cast, because it's hard to find data sets that have all the different countries in them, all the languages, and have a full matrix of all the votes from each one to everyone. So what we did is like the votes of the Eurovision Song Contest for the different countries, by the different countries. The thing is that this is voting, which is about finding a winner, and it was, I think, in the best year that we found was 0.25 correlated, so it's not that high. We're still looking to find a better data set to actually correlate here, what matches better what's happening in Wikipedia in terms of just attention. But again, there is some evidence here. The last thing, I'm just very quickly skim over this, is we did a simulation. We made an artificial network of the cuisines and languages, and just assumed that only popularity by one node would actually lead to more affinity. And then we did another one where we took the popularity, like Italian is more popular. We took single different directed affinity scores. That we also drew randomly from a normal distribution, and also a fixed self-focus. In a nutshell, what we found out is that these three factors together are really good at explaining the distribution of affinity scores we see in the data. So when we simulate like this, we found a really good fit with the affinity scores that we see here. So the basic message here is that these three factors are actually obviously explaining quite well what's happening here. So that was it for the paper. Now we did a little bit more since we did this paper, which we call Mining Cross-Cultural Relations from Wikipedia, but not only with cuisines. No, this is just the working title. So this is something we've done by a student of ours, a master's student. And basically what it says, like in the title, is we looked at these culture templates in Wikipedia and portal pages to find more dimensions than just cuisine. Turns out many of those are sadly too sparse. So many countries and languages many languages don't describe or very little of the other countries in those dimensions, so we could not use them. But at least for the 8, apart from cuisine that I list here, for example, literature and music, there were pages. So it would be like literature of England, literature of Belgium, literature of Estonia, or music, or history. That is a bar chart, and I will explain you what it means, a bot blocks chart. What you see here is on the bottom, these are, you cannot read this, don't try. There are cuisine and history, for example, history and people, and so on and so on. So it's always pairs of 2 dimensions. One data point here would be the cuisine and the history of Austria and how similar they are to the other countries. So Austrian cuisine is most similar to German, then to Italian, then to the Netherlands. The Austrian history is most similar to the German, to the Italian, to the Hungarian, etc., etc. What you do then is do a raised bang oval, and it's like a rank correlation of those 2 lists, and you find out how similar they are. This is one data point here. Then you can do the same thing for Belgium, for example, and so on and so on. So what you see here is you see that the scores, where the median is, and about the average, and you can see that actually most of these dimensions correlate quite okay with each other. So most of them are actually over 0.6 or 0.5 at least, which is between 0 and 1, a decent correlation actually. Apart from World Heritage Sites, which we found out is too much related to local geolocations that we can match it to anything. So that doesn't work. But the other ones do actually match quite well. And if you look at where cuisine is located here, cuisine is also quite well aligned with all the other dimensions. Sorry, dimensions, which gives us some confidence that what we found before about cuisines actually holds also for the other dimensions, which we're still in the process of evaluating actually. Then we looked also at similarity of neighbors, like we did for cuisine. And again, in each of these dimensions, there's a strong positive increase when you only look at the neighbors in each of them, and with each country. So that again is circumstantial evidence that what we found in cuisines is actually holding for all of the other things, that we might be measuring a same latent concept here. And lastly, understanding in between the dimensions. So we looked at how well, if a language understands the music of a certain country, how well does it understand the cinema of a certain country? Turns out quite well. So music cinema is the one that correlates most here. Then we have music and religion. Then we have literature and cinema, and so on and so on. So they actually do quite well. So you can be quite sure if someone understands the cinema of a country, then he will also understand the music of a country, like one language edition. Interestingly, the order here is, but not surprisingly, if you remember what I said before, the order here is completely different than the similarity. Yeah, not completely, but very much different than the similarity. So music and cinema would not be very similar, they would not correlate very much the similarity of two countries, but they would lead to better understanding. Which, when you think about that, I've showed before that the similarity and understanding don't correlate much, is not surprising here, but still, we try to find out why that is. Okay, to conclude, so we think that Wikipedia provides actually opportunities to infer cultural relations. We still have to find out if it's only by the Wikipedians, like how Wikipedians describe the world, or is it actually, are they representative of their language? We don't know it yet, but there are pointers to that this is the case, because a featured article, which are the best articles on Wikipedia, sometimes are written to 90% by one or two persons. And obviously they can do a good job at that, so we don't know yet. The offline validation of this in the terms of data sets like we had them in the European Social Survey is difficult. To find in multi-language and multicultural or multinational surveys or things that match exactly with what we have in Wikipedia is not easy. But we try to find more of these data sets. It could be for sure a complementary source of data for if you have a survey or something else. Maybe also look at Wikipedia and try to find differences or overlaps. Maybe they can lead you to at least to interesting questions. And lastly, like it's the case for all studies that show differences between language editions, it always is for the community, for the editors. It's important, especially in culture, to look at other languages and see what they describe. If they want to broaden their scope, if they want to be more diverse. If they don't want to, of course, they don't have to, but this is, if you want to include all the dishes from another country and want to describe it correctly, then you maybe should do that. So the last slide I have is in the next steps. We still don't know what we're actually measuring, if that is actually culture what we're measuring. And that is the most interesting question in my point of view. What are we actually measuring with these things? We obviously measure something that correlates over all these dimensions, but what it is, we still have to dig deeper. We could select different selections of dimensions in culture in Wikipedia, try to find others. We haven't succeeded yet to find some that are not so sparse. We could look at non-culture dimensions in the Wikipedia to find things that are country-specific but not cultural, but that's hard because country and culture is so tightly knit. Or look at pages that are like technology that are they're not linked to a country, but see how well they are described in both languages, for example, in two languages. Or just look at in these surveys that are there, like the ESS or the similar surveys, if we find better fitting items actually to measure against, like more like the practices instead of the beliefs, for example. Maybe that was too ambitious to think that there would be high correlation already in the beliefs, but that might be more insightful. And lastly, different data sets, online data sets, for example, because they are abundant, but if you find some that actually fit to the data that we have, that would be great. So for example, we're looking right now at artists and bands, and there are data sets that describe them from different languages and see if we can somehow replicate what we found here. Okay, sorry for going over time, that's it. Thank you.
Fabian, if you just stay there.
Yeah, sorry, I just get some
that's
more.
okay, yeah, no problem. Just want to introduce your respondent, Ellen Rutten, Professor of Slavic Languages and Culture at the University of Amsterdam. Ellen, your response.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you.
Can I get my paper to write down your questions?
Yes, you can. Thank you, Fabian, for an enlightening comparative Wikipedia reading. And before I continue, I want to clarify to our audience that I base my comments in part on a written paper by Fabian and his colleagues in today's topic. And I think that will be a problem, but just so that you know. So that which makes this session so exciting for me is its transdisciplinarity. And I'll say a bit more about that later in my own talk. That same transdisciplinarity, however, means that my theoretical toolkit includes only some of the methodological instruments that Fabian and his colleagues use. So those passages, I know you told us it's easy, the mathematical formulas, but some of the passages in his article are to me no less than total abracadabra. Luckily, other theoretical tools that you use do overlap more with those that my colleagues and I employ. And one key point of overlap is, of course, that of the study of culture. And this is the point on which I zoom in this comment. I would gladly hear your responses to two questions related to your take on culture as an analytical prism. And the first leads away a little bit from Wikipedia, but the second brings us back to it. The first, in presenting your outcomes, your colleagues and you quite minutely explain how, in crafting this cross-cultural analysis, you understand culture. You specify, so this is mostly in the paper, you specify that your definition of this notion builds on Bourdieu's, Hofstede's and Alavi's theorizations of culture. You explain that by cultural practices you refer to, for instance, literature, movies, music, and you claim that apart from food, music, literature and arts, could be fruitful additional cultural dimensions to study. And you show us here that you have actually been studying some of these additional dimensions. Now, in this approach to culture, that term which is so central to your analysis, you opt for quite a specific definition. You locate culture primarily in what we could call the domain of creative production. So that's where food culture, literature, music, etc. overlap. Now, in culture scholarship today, the dominant paradigm, I would say, and perhaps some people disagree, but I think this is at least not a controversial standpoint, is that of cultural studies. And cultural studies scholars promote an understanding of culture that stretches quite broadly, so well beyond that domain of creative production, the domain of literature, music, and food. In their more inclusive understanding of the concept, such scholars as Stuart Hall, Dick Hebdeich, they use it to study ideology, power, gender, nationality, and class. So my question to you is there a reason that you opted for this in cultural studies and cultural analysis today, not necessarily self-evident, narrower definition of culture that you propose? And if so, could you perhaps say a little bit more about that? Now, my second question, as I said, it brings us back to Wikipedia, and it's more of a searching question than my first one. In your written analysis, you claim that each, and I'm now citing Fabian and his colleagues, each language community may perceive and document their own and other cultural practices through their particular cultural lenses, end of citation. So this is something that I'm thinking about a lot myself. You here seem to imply that this is the cultural, as in local, belonging to a specific language or local community. So that is the cultural lenses of Wikipedia users that define how food-related Wikipedia entries are written. But in practice, and I think you said a little bit about that already, I expect the same Wikipedia author on, say, French baguettes to be not only French, if he or she is French, but also a woman, or perhaps more likely a man, colored, or perhaps more likely white, a 20-something, or of another age. So in short, I expect this author's identity to be defined by many more than cultural or regional parameters only. Now, I don't say that you should necessarily take all these levels into account, but I do wonder, in a cross-cultural study of Wikipedia writers and users, does it suffice to focus on their geopolitical or cultural background? And to what extent should we also include age, gender, class background, etc.? So this is a question that I often ask myself as a scholar in Russian studies. I'm a professor in Russian Slavic literatures, so I'm sometimes inclined to overemphasize the Russianness of my research subjects, and that's a bad habit that I very sternly try to correct whenever I spot it. But it's also my question to you as a cross-cultural explorer of Wikipedia writers. Thanks in advance for responding to
Thank you for the questions. So the first one was about why this narrow definition of cultures was chosen. And I have to say, so we're kind of new to the whole field. We're coming more from a computational social science or computational science background. And for us, these definitions were the most easy accessible definitions where we could think about operationalization.
Operationalizing.
This is a tongue breaker for me the whole day today, obviously. Sorry. So how can we put that into metrics?
Yeah.
So, and this would, it just jumped at us because of the things that we actually, it was also data driven. So what data do we have actually? Culture is for us, was easily described, it was not so sparse, music, etc., etc. These are the things that obviously people care about most on Wikipedia because they describe them mostly. So that is actually why we chose that. It was mostly data driven, not theory driven. But I would enjoy very much, and we totally have to do that as well, to talk with experts on this topic like you to find better definitions of culture. Because right now, this was one shot that we took with that definition, but we are totally aware of that this might not capture all of the facets of that topic, of that concept. And the second one, to demographics, you're totally right. This is, but again, I have to say again, this is always a convenient excuse for computer scientists like this data-driven as well, because it is the fact that we don't have the demographics of Wikipedia users. That's why we didn't study them. I totally agree that these are very important. What I can say maybe to counter that a little bit is that we know from other studies that most of the Wikipedia editors that we have are not so diverse demographically. So they are mostly male, white, etc., educated. But of course, you could study much more. And one thing we could do, I mean, you can find out what there have been people trying to do that on the IPs or on at least the location of people, where they actually come from, to actually look at the editors as well, not only at the concepts. But that's hard. It's very sparse information. Most people are registered, and you don't find anything about them. Many people don't have any information about them, what their gender is, etc., etc. But there could be looking at the data that we have and maybe combining it with some statistical inferences. We could try to also look at the demographics of people, etc., or looking at the interest that they have in other articles and categorizing them in that way. Like you could say that if someone only edits topics about Amsterdam or Liverpool, then you might put them in another, like in the English bracket, and etc., etc. Actually, that was something we also thought about. Like that's something that's very related to what Tommaso also presented. Like disagreements or interactions between editors that actually write those pages, or like just the provenance. And again, just look at the provenance. Where does the things come from? If you know something about the editors, then we could do much better inferences actually. Like if someone is a main editor in the Dutch Wikipedia, goes to the English one and writes about the Dutch cuisine, that is not an international relation in that sense, like we did, yeah? And we know that he represents Dutch people just writing in English. Because that's generally a problem in English Wikipedia. It understands everything very well, but just because people go there because they speak English. Yeah, but a very good point. I mean, the demographics here is something that is... What we also hear from sociologists at GESIS, which is a social science institute, hear a lot, is that a key thing that you would actually need to do better inferences about what's going on. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.